It began as an ordinary afternoon outside Westbridge Academy, the kind of prestigious school where luxury cars line the curb and security guards outnumber teachers. Parents with high-status careers and carefully tailored suits stood waiting for their children. Yet even in this world of immaculate perfection, one figure always stood out, the billionaire who arrived in a silent black sedan with tinted windows, accompanied by a driver, 2 security personnel, and the air of a man accustomed to barriers. No one ever approached him, no one ever thought to. His presence alone commanded distance. That day, however, something felt heavier around him. He stood with his daughter's small hand resting against the fabric of his coat, her eyes downcast, her posture withdrawn as usual. Though she was beloved by her father, she had not spoken since birth, communicating only through subtle gestures, glances, or brief touches. The girl's silence was not something the billionaire tried to hide. He adored her more fiercely than anyone could imagine, but it was a silence filled with weight and unanswered questions. And despite how much he tried to shield her from the world, her loneliness was always visible to anyone who paid attention. As parents exchanged conversations about weekend plans and the school's upcoming charity gala, the billionaire remained apart from it all. He checked his watch in a motion that had become habitual, though he had nowhere urgent to be except the refuge of his own home. The little girl tugged once at the sleeve of his coat, a soft gesture that meant she was anxious. He crouched down, whispered something comforting, but she did not lift her eyes. A sigh escaped him, not from impatience, but from helplessness. No amount of wealth, influence, or private specialists had found a way to reach her inner world completely. She communicated only when she wanted to, and even then, only in ways that left him guessing. Just a few feet away stood someone who did not belong to the glamorous world of Westbridge Academy. A single dad, his clothes slightly worn from long hours of work, waited quietly for his son to exit the building. He kept his distance from the more affluent families, as he always did, because he had learned long ago that people judged from the moment their eyes landed on him. But he was used to it. Life had taught him to stay humble, grounded, focused on what truly mattered. His child that he glanced casually in the direction of the billionaire, not out of curiosity, but because the little girl appeared visibly distressed. Her breathing seemed uneven, her small shoulders trembling slightly. He recognized the signs instantly, not of illness, but of emotional discomfort. His late sister, who had been deaf since childhood, used to show the same restless signals when overwhelmed. And just like he used to do for her, he instinctively made gentle hand movements, motions meant to catch someone's attention without startling them. It wasn't a full sign, not yet, but a simple wave of understanding. Something almost no one else noticed, yet the girl did. Her eyes lifted for the briefest second, and their gazes met. The father noticed the subtle connection but didn't think much of it. The billionaire, meanwhile, had never seen his daughter respond so suddenly to a stranger. His eyebrows narrowed with confusion, not suspicion, but a genuine curiosity he had not felt in years. Still, he said nothing. He chose to watch. As the minutes passed, the noise around them increased. Children spilled out of the school's entrance, laughing, shouting, reuniting with their parents. The billionaire's daughter stiffened at the noise, pressing her face against her father's coat. The world was too loud for her. Too unpredictable. Too overwhelming. And while her father tried to calm her, there were limits to what words could do. Words had never been hers to use. The single dad, standing off to the side, recognized the girl's discomfort as if he had known her all his life. It was the same expression his sister would make at crowded family gatherings, loud holidays, or chaotic school events. A language of silence he had learned to understand long before he could understand the spoken one. He looked at the little girl again, this time more intentionally, and slowly raised his hands. Without moving his feet, without stepping any closer, he shaped his fingers into a simple, universally gentle sign. "Are you okay?" It was subtle, soft, and respectful, and it changed the atmosphere instantly. The girl's eyes widened, not in fear, but in recognition. Not many people knew sign language, especially in environments like this. But she did. Her tutors used basic sign communication for emotional support, though it was rare for her to engage openly. Yet here, in this chaotic parking lot filled with rushing parents and honking cars, she responded to this unfamiliar man with a calmness neither her father nor her teachers had been able to achieve in moments of stress. Her small hands moved, hesitant at first, but deliberate. A slight motion toward her chest. A nod she barely made. It wasn't formal sign language, but it was meaningful. It was her way of replying, "I'm fine." I think several parents nearby witnessed the exchange and paused, whispering with surprise. Some covered their mouths. Others simply stared. A billionaire's daughter communicating freely, and to a stranger wearing work boots, was not something anyone at Westbridge expected to see. The billionaire himself felt the world slow around him. He looked at his daughter, then at the single dad, who seemed equally surprised at the girl's response. Something shifted inside the billionaire then. Not pride, not embarrassment, but awe. For years he had battled with the fear that no one would ever understand his daughter the way he wished he could. And now, a man from a completely different world stood just a few feet away, managing to reach her in a matter of seconds. As the crowd grew still, an unspoken realization settled over everyone present. Something extraordinary had just happened, something that transcended wealth, status, and silence itself. It was a moment of connection that came from compassion, something no amount of power could manufacture. Reporters would later describe this moment as the second the billionaire's guarded world cracked open. But to the witnesses who stood watching that quiet miracle unfold, it was more than that. It was the beginning of a story none of them could have predicted. What happened next unfolded not with dramatic fanfare, but with a quiet intensity that left everyone around unsure whether they should keep watching or respectfully look away. After witnessing his daughter respond so openly to a stranger, the billionaire found himself standing frozen, uncertain of the right next step. It had been years since he had seen her initiate or sustain a connection so willingly. The world around him, with its honking cars, chattering parents, and cluster of uniformed students, faded into a distant hum as he focused solely on the little girl and the man who had somehow reached her. He tightened his protective hold on her hand, not out of suspicion, but out of instinct. She looked more relaxed than he had seen her in days, her shoulders no longer drawn up toward her ears, her breathing no longer shallow and strained. A single moment of silent communication had shifted her entire emotional state. He studied the single dad, wondering how a man who had arrived so quietly could hold so much understanding in just a gesture. The single dad didn't approach. He made no attempt to insert himself into their world. In fact, once he saw the girl was calmer, he looked away, turning his focus back toward the school doors as if everything that had happened were the most natural thing in the world. He had merely responded to a child in distress using a language he knew. To him, it was kindness. To everyone else around, it felt like witnessing the impossible, but the billionaire wasn't willing to let the moment pass. His daughter rarely chose to engage, especially in crowded settings like this, and something deep inside him, part curiosity, part gratitude, asked him to find out more. He didn't walk forward aggressively, nor did he put on the intimidating air so many expected from a man of his wealth. Instead, he took a step forward with measured grace, lowering himself slightly to match his daughter's height before guiding her gently toward the man who had earned her trust so unexpectedly. The single dad noticed the movement and straightened his posture, unsure of the billionaire's intentions. People of extreme wealth often brought a level of tension with them, whether they intended to or not. He prepared himself for anything from a stern warning to a dismissive comment. Yet the billionaire's voice, when he spoke, carried neither hostility nor superiority. He simply asked a quiet question that stunned the single dad more than a reprimand ever would. "You understand her language?" The simplicity of the question carried the weight of years of struggle. It wasn't just about sign language, it was about understanding her world, her challenges, her silence. It was about reaching the spaces where even he, with all his resources, had felt powerless. The single dad nodded slowly, unsure how much to explain in front of the girl. He answered gently that he had learned sign language because his sister had been deaf and used it throughout her life. He mentioned it without embellishment, without seeking pity or admiration. To him, it was simply part of who he was. But to the billionaire, it explained everything: the calmness, the familiarity, the instinctive gestures he had used earlier. His daughter tugged lightly at his coat again, drawing his attention. She lifted her tiny hands and repeated one of the signs the single dad had shown her. It wasn't perfect, but it was earnest. And for a child who often kept her hands withdrawn and close to herself, it was monumental. The billionaire felt something inside him bend, soften, ache. He had spent fortunes trying to help his daughter communicate, therapists, specialists, private tutors, yet none had achieved what a stranger had done in less than 5 minutes. He exhaled, a barely noticeable but deeply felt release of tension, and found himself thanking the man quietly, sincerely. It wasn't something he said often. Gratitude was not a language he was accustomed to expressing. But in that moment, it came as naturally as breathing. The single dad brushed off the thanks, saying he was glad he could help. He wasn't trying to be modest, he genuinely didn't think he had done anything extraordinary. He believed it was simply what any decent person would do if they saw a child struggling. But the billionaire knew differently. In his world, kindness was often transactional, and empathy was sometimes overshadowed by social hierarchy. What he had witnessed was rare, not just kindness, but connection. Their brief interaction might have ended there had the billionaire's daughter not taken a step forward. Her tiny fingers reached toward the single dad's sleeve, brushing the fabric gently, as if asking him not to step away yet. The single dad froze, uncertain how to respond. Children rarely approached him out of the blue. Most parents tended to pull them back politely, quietly, sometimes with thinly veiled judgment in their eyes. But the billionaire did not stop her. Instead, he watched, letting her guide the moment. She moved her hands again, repeating the sign she had used earlier, this time more confidently. The single dad understood immediately and responded in kind, crafting a simple, comforting phrase in sign language that meant, "I see you. You're okay. I'm proud of you." The billionaire swallowed hard when he saw her face brighten, just slightly. It wasn't a smile, she rarely smiled in public, but something new, something fragile, something hopeful appeared in her expression. It was the kind of change only a parent could recognize, the kind they spent years waiting for. He asked the single dad if he taught sign language professionally, and the man shook his head, explaining that he worked manual jobs and only used sign within his own family. Then he apologized, thinking perhaps he had overstepped. But the billionaire shook his head gently. For once, he didn't feel the need to assert authority or formality. Instead, he surprised himself by asking another rare and vulnerable question: "Would you teach me? Teach us?" The single dad blinked, taken aback. A billionaire, one of the most private, powerful men in the city, was asking him, a working-class father, for help. Not a service to purchase, not a contract to sign, but help. Human help. Help born of experience, compassion, and lived understanding. It was a request that leveled the distance between two worlds. That he didn't answer immediately, not because he wanted to decline, but because he wanted to be absolutely sure the billionaire understood what he was asking for. Sign language wasn't just a tool, it was a commitment, a shared language, a promise to meet someone where they are rather than forcing them to reach where you want them to be. The billionaire nodded, sensing the hesitation and clarifying gently that he didn't need formal lessons, just a chance to understand the gestures that made his daughter feel safe. He said it with a sincerity that drew curious stares from parents nearby who were witnessing a man they had always viewed as untouchable lowering his defenses in public. The single dad looked at the little girl again, then at the billionaire, and finally gave a small nod of agreement. Not because he felt obligated, but because he saw the sincerity in both father and daughter. And because he believed, as he always had, that communication was a bridge everyone deserved to cross, especially children who lived in silent worlds. Reporters would later describe the moment as the day an unlikely teacher stepped into the life of a billionaire. But those who watched from the schoolyard knew it was more than that. It was the moment a little girl stepped out of isolation for the first time in her life. And it was the moment a father realized he might not have to walk her journey alone. In the days that followed their unexpected encounter outside the school, something began to shift, not in dramatic leaps, but in small, steady movements that were impossible to ignore. The billionaire, accustomed to schedules shaped by board meetings, negotiations, and constant demands on his time, suddenly found himself rearranging entire afternoons just to observe the quiet language his daughter had responded to so instinctively. For the first time in years, he wasn't directing his life, he was following hers. The single dad, too, found his routine subtly altered. He never sought attention and certainly never intended to step into the world of a man whose life was completely different from his own. Yet each afternoon, when he returned to the school to pick up his son, he would see the billionaire waiting with his daughter in the same spot where their first exchange had taken place. The billionaire did not call him over or insist on conversation. Instead, he simply stood nearby, always giving the impression that he was waiting for something, permission, perhaps, or simply the right moment. Eventually, it was the billionaire's daughter who closed the distance. She recognized the single dad every day, and her eyes warmed at the sight of him. Children rarely forget the first person who makes them feel understood. She would lift her hands in hesitant signs, tiny gestures she had practiced alone with her father at home. She would turn to the billionaire for reassurance, and he would encourage her with a patient nod. And slowly, the daily interactions grew into a familiar rhythm that both families began to depend on. The single dad's son noticed as well. A bright boy with a fearless personality, he had never given much thought to who stood where or what social differences separated people. To him, the billionaire was just another parent waiting for his child. But he could see how intensely the man watched his daughter, how deeply he wanted to reach her, and the boy understood instinctively that this was someone trying very, very hard to be a good father. One day, after witnessing another strained attempt from the billionaire to follow his daughter's gestures, the boy casually approached and offered to show him the correct signs. The billionaire bent down, lowered his pride without even thinking, and let the boy guide his hands. It was a humbling moment, a billionaire being taught by a child, but also a revealing one. Wealth had never solved the one challenge that mattered most, and he was willing to learn from anyone who could help him reach his daughter. Over time, what began as brief exchanges grew into longer conversations. The single dad and the billionaire stood together near the school entrance, surrounded by the chaos of parents and students, yet somehow creating a pocket of calm only their small group occupied. They talked about children before they talked about anything else, the universal language of parents. The billionaire shared the struggle of raising a daughter who could not express her fears, joys, or pain in the ways the world expected. The single dad spoke of raising his son alone, juggling work and responsibilities after his sister passed away, leaving behind the only family member who had ever needed sign language to communicate. The billionaire listened not with the politeness of a wealthy man engaging in small talk, but with the curiosity of someone desperate to understand real human experience. And for perhaps the first time in years, the single dad felt seen, not as a working-class father, not as a man with limited means, but as someone whose knowledge mattered, whose presence made a difference. But the true transformation was happening in the billionaire's daughter. With each passing day, the stiffness in her posture began to soften. She approached the world with less fear, less hesitation. Her hands, once tucked close to her body, began forming shapes with greater confidence. She started signing simple words before looking up to make sure her father understood. Every time he got one right, she would blink in surprise, as if she wasn't used to him understanding her. And every time he struggled, she would turn discreetly toward the single dad, who would gently demonstrate a clearer motion for her father to follow. It was a quiet circle of learning, the billionaire learning from the single dad, the daughter learning from both, and the boy watching with pride as the adults around him bridged worlds that normally never touched. Outside observers began to take notice too. Teachers commented on the little girl's newfound confidence. Parents whispered about seeing the billionaire kneeling beside the single dad, their heads bent together as they practiced hand movements once reserved for deaf communities. Some raised eyebrows, surprised by the unusual friendship. Others smiled privately, moved by the tenderness behind the daily ritual. But no matter the reactions, the small group remained unchanged in their routine. One afternoon, however, marked a turning point neither father could forget. It happened when the daughter, after a day that had clearly been overwhelming for her, ran out of the school building with tears in her eyes. The billionaire's breath caught instantly, fear gripping him. She rarely cried, not because she didn't feel deeply, but because expressing her distress outwardly was a challenge. He tried to stop her long enough to understand what was wrong, but she shook her head, overwhelmed. Before he could attempt another gesture, she spotted the single dad and ran toward him, not with the hesitation she normally had, but with pure instinct. She lifted her hands urgently, and he responded immediately, his own hands moving with a calmness that seemed to steady her heartbeat. They exchanged a short sequence of signs, and slowly, her panic eased. The billionaire watched helplessly, yet gratefully, as his daughter trusted this man enough to seek comfort in a moment of distress. when she was finally calm, she walked back to her father and signed out a single sentence, a sentence he recognized only because the single dad had taught him the day before. When he translated it in his mind, his chest tightened. She had said, "I felt scared. But he helped me understand my feelings." It was the first time she had ever expressed an emotion clearly, directly, and without retreat. For a father who had spent years searching for a way to reach her inner world, it felt like a miracle. When he looked at the single dad, the billionaire felt a gratitude too deep for words. He knew that money hadn't bought these moments, connection had. Kindness had. Humility had. A man who had no reason to step into their lives except compassion had given his daughter something he could never repay. That evening, long after the school had emptied, the billionaire found himself standing alone in the quiet of his home, replaying the moment again and again. His daughter's hands, the clarity in her expression, the relief in her breaths, the way she leaned into his side afterwards, it all pointed to one undeniable truth: the single dad had become a bridge to a world the billionaire and his daughter had struggled to reach for years. For the first time, the billionaire realized that what had begun as a simple gesture on a busy school morning had grown into something far more powerful than any of them had imagined. It wasn't just a shared language. It was the beginning of a bond that would reshape not only the life of a little girl but the lives of both fathers as well. As the weeks unfolded, the quiet bond forming between the billionaire, his daughter, the single dad, and the little boy began to evolve into a relationship that stretched beyond school gates and hurried afternoon exchanges. What began as simple conversations grew into a slow but steady weaving of two families who had come from completely different worlds but found unexpected common ground through compassion. The billionaire, who once lived in a world insulated by business meetings, security personnel, and the constant pressure of public image, now found himself rearranging his days to create space for simple human connection, something he had almost forgotten how to nurture. Each afternoon became a ritual he never dared to miss. He would arrive earlier than necessary not because he had time to spare but because he wanted the comfort of knowing he wouldn't miss an opportunity for his daughter to experience another step of growth. He brought books on sign language, kept a small notebook in his pocket filled with reminders and diagrams, and practiced every spare moment as though preparing for the most important presentation of his life. And in a way, he was preparing to be a father who could finally speak to his daughter in a way she understood. The single dad, though humbled by the billionaire's quiet determination, never allowed the growing attention from others to change his approach. He remained patient, kind, and steady, treating each interaction with the billionaire's daughter with the same respect he had always shown. He understood, perhaps better than most, that communication was not only about As the weeks unfolded, the quiet bond forming between the billionaire, his daughter, the single dad, and the little boy began to evolve into a relationship that stretched beyond school gates and hurried afternoon exchanges. What began as simple conversations grew into a slow but steady weaving of two families who had come from completely different worlds but found unexpected common ground through compassion. The billionaire, who once lived in a world insulated by business meetings, security personnel, and the constant pressure of public image, now found himself rearranging his days to create space for simple human connection, something he had almost forgotten how to nurture. Each afternoon became a ritual he never dared to miss. He would arrive earlier than necessary not because he had time to spare but because he wanted the comfort of knowing he wouldn't miss an opportunity for his daughter to experience another step of growth. He brought books on sign language, kept a small notebook in his pocket filled with reminders and diagrams, and practiced every spare moment as though preparing for the most important presentation of his life. And in a way, he was preparing to be a father who could finally speak to his daughter in a way she understood. The single dad, though humbled by the billionaire's quiet determination, never allowed the growing attention from others to change his approach. He remained patient, kind, and steady, treating each interaction with the billionaire's daughter with the same respect he had always shown. He understood, perhaps better than most, that communication was not only about vocabulary but about presence. It was about letting a child know they were seen and understood without pressure or expectation. The billionaire watched this closely and learned not only the technique of signing but the gentleness required to use it well. The little girl's progress became impossible to ignore. Teachers reported she was more engaged in class, more expressive in her gestures, and increasingly comfortable interacting with other children. She had always been intelligent, but communication barriers had kept her locked behind silence. Now, with new confidence, her personality began to shine in ways no one expected. She laughed more often, leaned on her father's shoulder when she wanted affection, and used her small hands to share moments of her day that she had previously kept buried inside. Sometimes her signs were clumsy, sometimes her sentences incomplete, but every gesture carried a piece of her heart. And every time her father understood, her smile stretched a little wider. The billionaire treasured each breakthrough. He began to rediscover the version of himself that existed before business overshadowed everything, a man capable of deep emotion, capable of joy that wasn't tied to profit margins or successful ventures. His daughter's transformation was the mirror he didn't know he needed. She showed him the wealth he had been blind to, the richness found not in status but in connection. And beneath all of it was the steady presence of the single dad, whose knowledge, empathy, and quiet strength had made this change possible. As the relationship deepened, the little boy also grew increasingly involved, taking on the role of an enthusiastic teacher. He showed the billionaire quick tricks to remember certain signs, patiently corrected him when he mixed up gestures, and occasionally teased him in good-natured humor when he got something hilariously wrong. The billionaire welcomed the teasing with humility that surprised even himself. He had spent years commanding rooms, negotiating with world leaders, and running corporations, yet here he was, letting a child hold him accountable, and enjoying it, but not everything unfolded without tension. Rumors began to spread among other parents and within the billionaire's corporate circles. Some whispered that he was forming an unusual friendship that could affect his public image. Others questioned why a man of his stature needed help from someone they considered beneath him socially. A few even suggested that the single dad was taking advantage of the situation for personal gain. But the billionaire, for once, paid no attention. He had spent his life listening too closely to the noise of public expectation. Now he was learning to ignore it. One afternoon, after a particularly stressful day, he found himself confessing something to the single dad he had never admitted to anyone outside his small inner circle. He spoke quietly of the loneliness he had felt since losing his wife, of how raising his daughter alone had been both the greatest honor and the most overwhelming challenge of his life. He described the guilt of not knowing how to help her, the silent fear that he was failing her, and the weight of trying to navigate grief and parenthood without a partner. The single dad listened with genuine empathy. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer empty reassurances, and didn't treat the billionaire like a fragile man seeking comfort. Instead, he shared his own struggles, losing his sister, stepping into a role he never expected, and learning sign language not from a textbook but from necessity. What emerged in that exchange was not only mutual respect but something deeper, understanding. Both men had lost something precious and now found themselves rebuilding their worlds for the sake of the children who depended on them. Both had confronted grief, uncertainty, and the daily battle to be enough. And through those honest conversations, a friendship began to solidify, one built not on status or circumstance but on shared humanity. As the days grew colder and the evenings arrived earlier, the billionaire began inviting the single dad and the children for short visits, first to a nearby cafe, then to a quiet corner of his office building where the kids could work on school assignments while the adults practiced sign language. What surprised the billionaire most was how natural these moments felt. There was no awkwardness, no sense of imbalance, no feeling that one family was hosting another. Instead, it felt as though their lives were gradually folding together in a way that made sense. The little girl, who had once regarded the world with timid uncertainty, now blossomed in the presence of the boy she considered her first real friend. They played with ease, signing small jokes to one another, laughing at secrets only their hands could express. She began showing more affection, gently tugging her father's sleeve whenever she wanted his attention, confidently signing her needs and feelings without fear of misunderstanding. Her transformation was so profound that one evening, as he watched her sign an entire story about her day, the billionaire felt tears sting his eyes. Not because he pitied her or mourned the years of silence, but because he finally felt the connection he had longed for since the moment she was born. And behind that miracle was the single dad, whose kindness had reached into a life far different from his own and changed it forever. In the midst of these changes, a new sense of peace settled over the billionaire's home. His daughter, once quiet and withdrawn, now filled the space with expressive movement. The silence that once haunted the rooms no longer felt heavy, it felt meaningful. Sign language had become the family's new way of speaking, a language of hands, heart, and hope. And as father and daughter grew stronger together, the billionaire realized something he hadn't understood before. Sometimes the most valuable people in one's life are those who enter unexpectedly, offering nothing but kindness. That he knew the single dad had not only changed his daughter's future but had reshaped his own. What he did not yet know was how deeply this connection would continue to evolve, and how profoundly it would redefine both families in the days ahead.